but they are not the only areas in EPTRI. You will see, and I'm going now to invite Mark Turner. There is also an area dedicated to the link to the clinical phases, and so it's a pleasure to leave the ground to Mark. He's very well known from Liverpool University and also the scientific coordinator of the IME2 C4C project.
Donato, thank you very much. I'm very sorry I need to leave at 1:30, so I might not be available for questions. Next slide, please. So the role of EPTRI is twofold. First of all, EPTRI will inject expertise into clinical studies. So what dose to give, which biomarkers to use, the formulation for clinical trials, as we've heard from the platforms, but also we need to project expertise from clinical studies into the work. And when we hear about biomarkers and drug discovery, then ideally all that work is informed by the clinical perspective. What are the clinical needs? What is possible, and so on. And EPTRI needs to facilitate these two discussions. Next slide. EPTRI will do this in 3 ways. First of all, during the selection phase, so that the selection committee will identify where this two-way dialogue is necessary and will facilitate the pieces of that dialogue and find the right people to join that dialogue. Then secondly, there'll be a centralized service that will contribute to the selection process, but also take this broader view of how to include clinical perspectives in the non-clinical work and how to make sure that non-clinical work is used properly and translated into clinical studies. And thirdly, to create a framework for a common plan of action with relevant pediatric initiatives. Next slide. I'm sorry, this text has been duplicated, but Donato, sorry, thank you. So Donato has outlined the service selection process. So we'll just say that the voice of the clinical community will be there during the access and selection process. Next slide. The centralized service will work with all the different stakeholders to prepare particular clinical studies and more general actions that are generic to pediatric research. And by clinical studies, we mean studies that recruit children, babies, young people. So the biomarker studies that you need to do to qualify or to validate a biomarker, these are clinical studies. And one of the things that we can offer is a large number of sites across Europe who can join in biomarker studies. So if somebody has a biomarker in Estonia, then through C4C, through EPTRI, we can link them up with sites in Portugal or Ireland or Italy. And so preparing clinical studies at site level and at protocol level will be possible through all the discussions that we can have. When people design protocols, be they for biomarkers or formulations or clinical trials of investigational medicinal products, then the clinical input is essential at the start of the protocol development so that the study is feasible and acceptable. And of course, we need to put the voice of children and young people and their parents at the center of protocol development. And through the common service for ethics and legal and social implications, and through the central service for clinical work, we can make sure that all the voices are heard during development of any study that recruits babies, children, or young people. Next slide. I've put this slide up for completeness, and I hope you can download the slides later. I'm not going to go through every row here, but the idea is that when people are designing a clinical study, be it a observational biomarker or a clinical trial, then the platforms in EPTRI can contribute to all the steps of developing protocols: design, methodology, feasibility, dosing, safety, sample size. Next slide. Chemistry, manufacturing controls, ethics, and so on. And you can see in the right-hand column, each of the EPTRI platforms has a strong role to play in the design of clinical studies that can make the most of the work that everybody does to underpin clinical studies. Next slide. So the centralized service will be able to share information, introduce people to relevant expertise. So if a clinician has an idea and they need to find someone to help develop that idea, then that can be a two-way discussion. And I know that the European reference networks do a lot of this work for rare diseases. And I know that the oncology community does this very effectively. But we need to make sure that all children's diseases have access to these sorts of services. So EPTRI will be able to fill the gaps as people talk to each other. And as I've said, people who need to find clinical resources, be that sites or participants or biobanks or anything based in a hospital or an outpatient or a polyclinic, that EPTRI will be able to reach out to EMPRIMA, to C4C, and all the other groups that have these networks to be able to facilitate timely clinical trials. Next slide. So as people have mentioned through the day, EPTRI has links, has overlap, has operational procedures with relevant groups. Alexandru kindly mentioned the Connect for Children C4C Pan-European Network for Clinical Trials with 20 countries, more than 200 sites, each coordinated at national level. And Johan will explain that model about how C4C national hubs can work with EPTRI national nodes. There are many specialty networks such as Printo, Penta, CEOP, and other research consortia that EPTRI will have links with in order to have this two-way discussion. And of course, it's essential to work with the European reference networks and the joint program. And these discussions are ongoing. We have steering committees. We're working on the response to the FDA's comments on global clinical trials networks, for example. So everyone is working together. Next slide. In conclusion, pediatric drug development needs to be relevant to the needs of babies, children, and young people. It needs to be integrated horizontally, geographically across Europe, and it needs to be vertically integrated. The preclinical studies, the formulations need to be influenced by what children will accept and what will lead to good information for prescribers and families. EPTRI provides that horizontal integration across Europe, and through this central service, it provides vertical integration across drug development. Thank you very much. I'll stop there.
Thanks a lot, Mark. for this great presentation. We really look forward to work together with all the networks, initiatives you have mentioned. I'm sorry that you are leaving, but of course you can join later, so any questions could be also recalled later. So let's go on with the program. Now there will be presentations related to the feasibility studies. That was, as I mentioned at the beginning, the third and last phase of the EPTRI project. So the one used to design the new scenario of EPTRI activities and of pediatric research. So the first presentation is from Adriana Ceci as chair of the advisory board. Please, Adriana.
Okay, thank you, Donato. We can go to the first and the second one slide. To introduce the concept of feasibility phase in EPTRI project that will include, has included many activities aimed to test the concept of EPTRI and capacity of EPTRI to deal with the main engagement of the project. You can find some example of the feasibility study performed with, for example, with government, with external stakeholder. Also in the stakeholder survey that is annexed to this meeting, you can find idea on the service provided by the presentation of Duccio, but I will concentrate the presentation on the first and more relevant feasibility studies group that are studies dedicated to the scientists to test the capacity of EPTRI to respond to the user, to the scientific user community. Next slide, please. The main aim is to determine whether an intervention required by a user should be or not be recommended in EPTRI. This is the first point. Which user request should be accepted in terms that they respond to EPTRI aim and capacity. The second point is to demonstrate that what we are identifying in EPTRI design that has been just now described in the 4 thematic platform and in the centralized service for connecting preclinical and clinical is able to answer to this user request. By doing this, it has been also possible to collect many information that has helped us to prepare the future EPTRI activities. Next one. One point that has been tested is the model that has been presented by Duccio as the EPTRI model to provide service. So we have described a 2-step procedure with a first step consisting in accepting the user request and assessing them to provide that the proposal meets EPTRI mission, that in general it's possible to recognize that EPTRI has capacity resource, and in particular that the content are valuable scientific content. So the user has sent a proposal through a simulated single access point that for the feasibility studies was provided by OPVG as partner of EPTRI. Next one. To assess this proposal, it has been created an ad hoc advisory board that will be translated in future EPTRI in the user selection panel, and that has been composed by many specialists, is a multi-speciality panel, and that also has included a member of the Ethic Advisory Board of EPTRI, also representing patients' need. Choose, we will add a complete panel to assess the proposal. Next one. The second step has consisted in taking into account the user request selected by the advisory board and provide a complete description of this request. Choose to check the service available in EPTRI, to collect all the opinion from the thematic research platform, from the centralized service, both general service and clinical bridging service, to collect in the opinion of the ethic advisory board and also of the group that is involved in patients' involvement. At the end, all the report regarding this analysis has been prepared. Next one. This is the result from the advisory board assessment. First of all, we can note that we received, after a call, an internal, just a few external users were also informed of this possibility to apply for feasibility study, and we received 10 proposals instead of the 5 that were planned in EPTRI project. So this has been the first demonstration that the system, even is simplified for the feasibility study, is functioning and efficacious. The advisory board has followed a peer review model assessment, has identified a rapporteur, co-rapporteur, and then has made a common assessment by collecting all the opinion of the group. The conclusion has been that all proposals were fitting with pediatric preclinical and translational research, so they were into the mission of EPTRI. We noted that each proposal included more than one researcher service, many researcher services that are required came back to the user to acquire more specific indication of what they exactly need. But at the end, we collected a total of 19 different research services by putting together all the requests. Practically, all the 4 thematic research platforms were involved in the research request. Mainly the more submitted to this question has been the biomarker and developmental pharmacology platform, but also a number of requests were for receiving centralized service. 9 requested also to receive an ethic advisory board assessment, and 8 proposals asked to receive the opinion of the patients group. So all the activities foreseen in EPTRI were under request from the user. Next one. Regarding the last point I cited, so the excellence and the innovation value of the request, shortly we have listed all the feasibility study requests received, because really each of them included excellent science and potential innovative, very interesting. This vary from request to apply placenta studies, to create, identify new bioactive compound, to make experimental pediatric medicine formulation, to create an algorithm to identify and select biomarker useful explicitly for pediatric sepsis. And in one case, we received an application to put in an advanced phase of research a new product for pediatric oncology disease. Next one. But also to cover a very large pattern of research capacity, prediction of new serum biomarker, provide diagnostic tool for neonate, study with using data science model the heterogeneity of neuropsychiatric pediatric disease, to understand the innovation to identify new target for rare diseases, and again to provide innovative formulation adapted to be assumed by very young children. Next one. This anticipates the value that we can expect when EPTRI will be operative. In the step 2, our need has been to understand, to identify if EPTRI include service provider that are able to respond to that need. To do this, we have required more detail to better identify the need. We have consulted the inventory of service that Duccio has presented this morning. That is the inventory of all the research service, the research unit included in EPTRI. We are required the opinion of the thematic research platform chair, but also the opinion of the Centralized Service on Clinical Link and other centralized service, and the opinion of the Ethic Board and PPI. Next one. Those are the results of this exercise. We have been able to identify, for a total of the 90 research service, all research unit able to provide that service. This is just an exercise because practically it will be not necessary to put in activities all these research units. But this is a very relevant exercise for us, demonstrating that the offer within EPTRI is really large, and we can provide a service whatever in Europe, and also, as you know, outside Europe. Next one. At the same time, we were able to assure that requests regarding centralized service could be covered by the centralized service that are foreseen in EPTRI. I would like to note that 7 out of 10 requests were related to the need to translate preclinical and basic research results into a clinical research phase. So just what Mark explained before. And also a very large number require ethic and regulatory support. Next one. This is an example on how we are used this EPTRI capacity. For example, in case of an ethic advisory board, this is the contribution for the study that will be presented just after my presentation by Evelyn on the melatonin administered during pregnancy. It's important that the ethics committee has recommended exactly how to deal with ethical regulatory requirement in Europe to assure conformity to good laboratory practice and to assure agreement for data and biological material during the study. Next one. We can skip, those are other 2 examples of 2 other studies. Next one. This is the contribution of the patients group. The recommendations are also relevant because all of these recommendations should be translated in operation during EPTRI activities. So they recommend to involve children in all the phases, not just during the provision, for example, of a clinical study, but also to help us in design the discovery and the preclinical phase of research. They also put for implement awareness campaign, is what said before Dimitrios, for example, and to promote communication material to explain also to young people what pediatric research means, which are the advantages that we can gain promoting this. Next one. Finally, we have evaluated this feasibility study in terms of understand the contribution in terms of sustainability, advantage, innovation potentials to cover specific gap. Just a short example of this evaluation. Next one. We have considered this study of help in increase, for example, the scientific capacity building of EPTRI by stimulating integration with pediatric research group and to facilitate, for example, grant need collaboration. They are useful to increase sustainability because they demonstrate, for example, the capacity to go on to activate public-private new collaboration and in this way to become attractive for sponsors. Next one. We also have underlined the social value of some of these proposals. This is an example made on the oral liquid formulation. This because EPTRI has also developed a survey among children to understand which formulation can be effectively addressed to children. And finally, an economic value can derive by attracting private funder and sponsor, because we will be able to provide a well-organized collaborative research framework. Next one. Just to summarize, which we consider the more relevant result of this study. The first one, the procedure has demonstrated to be successful. Many proposals, more than expected, were received. The majority of services are potentially covered. In one case, we decide to contact another research infrastructure. And this is in the line with the decision not to repeat what other research infrastructure already are able to do. 6 proposals were oriented to the use of IT tool and data interoperability. In this also has been an additional input to put in place this interoperability service that will be done in collaboration with Elixir. And finally, 7 on 10, as I said, required service to identify children sample and data collection, as well as service to bridge translational research to the clinical setting. So our final consideration is that feasibility studies have been offered in well-designed EPTRI infrastructure. Thank you.
Thank you, Adriana. I'm so sorry that we have not time to discuss, so we go immediately to Evelyn Jacques-Gren, Paris University, and Robert de Bertal, with an example of one of the 10 feasibility studies that were included in the advisory board assessment and evaluation. The title of the study is Melatonin Administered During Pregnancy as a Potential Neuroprotective Agent Against Neonatal Brain Damage. Please, Evelyn.
Good morning. Can I have the next slide, please? Thank you, Donato. Yes, so you can give me the next one. And I will give you there a very small, short background on the justification of melatonin feasibility study. Fetal and neonatal brain injury, as you may know, have multiple causes, primarily prematurity, with frequent complication of hypoxia, hemorrhage, and infection. This results in high morbidity and long-term consequences, including primarily motor sensitive and cognitive dysfunction. And the impact is really dependent on gestational age, the younger, the worse, and duration and severity of the event. At the moment, there are multiple strategies that are currently tested to reduce the impact and to validate prevention strategies, including therapeutic hypothermia or delayed umbilical cord clamping. And the use of melatonin is discussed because it may have an important role as a neuroprotector agent. Can I have the next one, please? melatonin, as you may know, is synthesized in the pineal gland. It's an hormone with specific receptor, which is really interesting in the context here, because it has both anti-inflammatory properties and protective effects against oxidative stress. And oxidative stress is a main component of brain injury. It's synthesized by the placenta during pregnancy, and it has an excellent safety profile. Although major issues are related to the very short half-life of this compound, and we will go back to that a bit later. Next one, please. As you know, on this slide, melatonin has been tested in animal models, rats, mouse, and the experiments here confirms the neuroprotective properties in different models of injury, like cordo occlusion, asphyxia, for example. In addition to these preclinical animal demonstration of efficacy, we already have fetal and neonatal data showing that in preterm neonates, melatonin circulating levels are low comparing to term neonates. And this is one of the factors that may influence the importance of injury, and making melatonin supplementation at birth or even during pregnancy a potential strategy to limit brain injury. Next slide, please. So the aim of our feasibility study was to test the potentiality of EPTRI to provide innovative research services to conduct the melatonin study presented, and then taking into account objective, methodology, services needed, and in addition, needing some evaluation of the timing and cost of the study. The objectives were on the next slide: to evaluate and in some aspect confirm the neuroprotective effect of melatonin in preterm neonates when administered to the mother during or prior to fetal distress, using preclinical models and translational data on the physiology of melatonin during normal and complicated pregnancy. In addition, this new innovative data will be available to predict placental metabolism and transfer to the fetus, to give additional information on fetal disposition, efficacy, and safety, and then may provide important information that may influence drug dosage and administration of other drugs, either already marketed or new drugs to be developed. Next slide, the methodologies will use animal studies to determine melatonin concentration in maternal and fetal plasma, placenta, fetal brain, to determine and confirm, in fact, its safety profile, to analyze melatonin pharmacodynamics in the developing organism. And for that, we need to select appropriate models, and primarily models with hemochorial placenta, which is a type of placenta in humans. And we need also to analyze the physiological level of melatonin, fetal and neonatal exposure without supplementation of drug, and if possible with supplementation. And long-term follow-up will probably be difficult to extrapolate, and this has to be worked on. Next slide, please. One of the interesting methodology, which is quite new, could be to use a placenta on a chip, which is a microfluidic device mimicking placental function, which is interesting because it's a very practical model with a large number of applications, which is certainly promising, but a recent approach that needs first to be validated and probably also to be improved in terms of fabrication. Next slide. To conduct these feasibility studies, there is a need for scientific and technical development, and primarily expertise is needed at all the different steps of research, as we need also large panel of techniques, and we need to be sure that all these techniques, some of them are quite new, are validated and controlled. And in addition to that, we will need to have pharmacometrics and bioinformatics to be able to analyze and extrapolate the data from animals to preliminary clinical studies. Next slide. The feasibility study process was very nicely summarized by Adriana in the previous presentation, so I will go to that very shortly. After submission, the feasibility study was assessed by the advisory board. They reported on services availability and provided a feasibility study report. Next slide, please. The assessments concluded that the proposal meets EPTRI mission and abilities, and that the feasibility study might use all the research units that are included in the developmental pharmacology platform, and also centralized services. The scientific content was judged excellent, and thank you to the advisory board. And the main contribution to EPTRI valorization could be valorization of many preclinical, ex vivo, in vitro research needed to perform a pediatric drug developmental plan. It used also application of laboratory methodologies. It also will be able to perform translational research, and translational relevance was noted, and that maybe these studies might be able to attract funds. The step 2, next slide, was recommendation from the advisory board. First, they identified in the proposal contributions that are needed from EPTRI: animal pregnancy model, ability to perform human in vitro data during healthy pregnancy and during disease-complicated pregnancy, capacity and contribution to analyze potential impact of covariates, perform pharmacometrics, pharmacokinetics, physiological PK data approaches, small volume of analytical assay, and even in vitro cell-based models to assess placental transports. In addition, as we said previously, this could be conducted in the developmental pharmacology platform. And translational translation of the results to clinical development has also been discussed and should be considered. But we have to remember here that knowing the difficulties in clinical trials in neonate and in pregnancy, all this expertise might be able to overcome all these difficulties, and maybe in addition, in collaboration with the formulation platform, and this was not really mentioned already, that this collaboration may be needed to obtain a more stable melatonin drug. As if you remember, I told you earlier that the short half-life of melatonin makes this drug very difficult to use in the context of pregnancy. Next slide, please. The report on service availability was made available by a coordination group that identified which research unit within a EPTRI would be able to meet the user request. And as you can see on the right part, 5 units were able to contribute to pharmacometrics, 2 to animal pregnancy models, 2 to animal model for safety and efficacy, 2 might contribute to in vitro cell-based model to assess placental transport and functionality, and 1 would be able to contribute by setting analytical methods adapted to the objective of this feasibility of this study. On the next slide, I presented the additional services that EPTRI could provide for activation of contact with pediatric clinical initiatives, to identify funding opportunities, and to provide ethical and regulatory support, which is really a key issue when we are dealing with neonatology and with pregnancy trials. Next slide. So the melatonin feasibility studies was proposed by our team in collaboration with Saskia and with Tessa. As we are involved in pregnancy research and pregnancy care, to test the potentiality of EPTRI to provide innovative research service in this field. To conduct the project, 8 identified units in 6 countries were identified within the EPTRI placental platform, which is one part of the developmental pharmacology platform. And in this platform, there is the expertise and capacity to conduct such research in collaboration with the central services that are provided by EPTRI. And in the context of this study, we would be able to provide translational data that will allow to optimize the clinical trial of melatonin during pregnancy to prevent brain injury. Thank you. Can I have the last one?
Thanks a lot, Evelyn. This very, very good presentation, a clear demonstration on how it is needed to link preclinical with the clinical phases and to have a unique pathway to enhance pediatric research. And now, last but not the least, I'm very happy to introduce Johan van de Waal with a very good example on what is the work to be done at country level, because we have designed the model of creating a national node in all the countries participating to EPTRI, but this is becoming also a reality in some countries. And this is going also in parallel with applications in several countries to the national ESFRI roadmaps, as it was done in Belgium a couple of months ago, with an excellent synergy between several universities and research centers, but also with the C4C National Hub, because Johan is also the C4C National Belgian Hub coordinator. So please, Johan, the ground is yours.
Thanks you for your nice introduction. Although if the Belgium concept is successful, has still to be proven. So if Donato had a dream just like King 40 years ago, I wanted to join the dream, but I have to say it becomes on some moments a little bit a nightmare, and I will try to explain that. You have had already many speakers of different centers, of which the majority do know each other for several consortia from the past. But if pediatric research is mainly targeting rare conditions and rare techniques, then it's also often that those research is happening in different centers that are not really connecting with each other. So when we try to build up such an EPTRI Belgium joint research unit, we tried to get a full plan of what's happening in Belgium and to put that together. But that's not easy. Next slide. And as you can see here in this phase, we have already been able to have 7 research units, of which 6 of the 7 universities are present joining in these efforts. So we have almost all centers pediatric research in Flanders, Brussels, and Wallonie. But we don't have yet the industry groups who are doing research that could serve also. That's the next step. Next slide. So you have seen already this slide, but we have used it in practice. I mean, how can you organize a model that is acceptable? The previous speaker was from Paris, and although in France they would have no sensitivity at all if Lyon would take the lead, I mean, in Belgium, it's something different. So we were very grateful that we could use, with acceptance of all parties, the national hub facilities that we have created for C4C. Don't misunderstand me, C4C and EPTRI are different, but with that we had a governance structure that was already in place and that we could use to identify all the expertise in the different centers. So the node will represent a stable association between all the EPTRI participant research institutions within our country, but in parallel with what we have built up for C4C. Of course, Belgium is a little bit different from some other countries. We are extremely small, so every center does know each other, and distances are rather small. So that has made it possible to visit all the centers personally and to get them involved. And that will be a very big task that we are including really all facilities. That will be crucial. Next slide. So these national modes will, and most have already been committed to support the integrations of all efforts. I mean, every university is mostly in 1 to 4 disciplines of expertise very strong, but those ones do not know what would be in other universities complementary. So that's where we are really making a full Excel file of all facilities that they are there. To avoid duplication and overlapping of competitive activities in the country, we try to integrate all these efforts in our research unit map. And where possible, we will try also to not to guide, but to support those different pediatric research initiatives in a pediatric clinical trial network, what we are building now up. That's something that's in parallel with some other countries within Europe. So EPTRI will be in contact with the hub of the C4C consortium, and is also the hub for the BPCRN. What is our the same hub will be used so for 3 different items. This next slide. Now, as already mentioned, Belgium is more complex even than Europe, because in a country like Belgium, there are a lot of sensitivities. we have a French-speaking part, and we have a Dutch-speaking part, and we have even a German-speaking part. We have 4 governments, and we have more members of parliament than India. So, but for budgets, some budgets are national and some budgets are regional. So to go for funding and for an application, we had to go to the Flanders Foundation, and that's where our EPTRI Flanders part has done the application for. And for example, Karel Allehart was together with me one of the leaders of that part. And we have to applicate with a parallel application to the French-speaking part. Of course, those 2 parts, and we have already the names on paper, those 2 parts will join to Europe to communicate. But we are communicate also as one unit to the Belgian Pediatric Clinical Trial Network to connect for children and to all other items that you have seen already on previous slides. Next slide. So we have started to look which parts are in our thematic research platforms. And you have seen already in the slides of Tessa and others that Belgium was several times mentioned, but we have now already had some overview of what is present in Belgium, like the placental and umbilical cord and 3D organoid cell cultures for pediatric samples, preclinical models of juvenile cirrhosis for biliary atresia, models of juvenile liver failure, models of different rare diseases, and also very important for us are the juvenile animal models, and even a little bit the battle within Belgium if we should go for the Göttingen mini pig or for the conventional pig. Each has advantages and contra effects. And of course, we have on several sites the zebrafish models. There are several teams working on pediatric biomarkers and biosamples, where we are doing identification, characterization, and validation. And since we have several regional or national drug studies, we can also to look if they can serve as prognostic tools and safety markers. There is strong expertise in developmental pharmacology at several universities, and there are several units also working on pediatric medicines, formulations, and medical devices. Now, surprising or not surprising, even within Belgium, nobody did know really what the others was doing. So thanks to the initiative of EPTRI, there we were already able now to map this. Very important is also that we are working together with other networks. I mentioned already C4C, but also the BBMRI ERIC for pediatric biobanking, and there's also close correlation with the oncological research and biobanking groups. Next slide. Now, I will not go through this, but because in interest of time, but as you can see here, there are several universities present every time with a very clear target person that does not serve only for his research line, but for the whole research lines in his unit. And there's quite diversity of research now put into the map. Next slide. And this is in developmental pharmacology, where also several centers are involved. Next slide. So we want, thanks to this initiative, even in Belgium, to create an integrated pediatric research system that links together with that EPTRI and that can serve as hub for that EPTRI, but also for other research institutions and initiatives. The integrated system can provide expertise, experience, facilities, and practical support for preclinical and clinical pediatric research in Belgium and Europe. And we want to share that also together with the initiatives taken to identifying patients' needs and needs for pediatric research. The overarching goal of EPTRI Belgium is to create a framework for basic and translational pediatric research to facilitate the development of new innovative medicines for children in the phase before the C4C research program. Next slide. So we have defined 7 KPIs, and I mean one of is already in a far stage. That's in the inventory of all dedicated research infrastructure or potential research infrastructure for pediatric translational research. I will not go to the whole list because we are far over time, but I leave that for the questions. Many thanks. Next slide. I think it's finished. Yeah. Next slide. So I squeezed it a little bit for the time.
Thank you, Johan. It was great, a very interesting example on how you are already organizing resources in Belgium. So this was the last presentation.